Hi everybody, welcome back to the Magical Man Cave. I'm Neil, it says so down here. And in today's video I'm going to be talking to you about lighting, which as you can probably tell above me is going to be a little bit of a strange kind of video. And it's also going to focus on my own man cave, but with a lot of emphasis on your own, because you may not necessarily want a wizard themed pub as your own man cave theme, because this is very much for me. Every man cave is going to be different. Every person's man cave and style is going to be different. You're going to want something that suits you and suits your own desires, your own dreams, your own wishes, your own interests. And I totally get that, that's fine. But this video is all about lighting of a man cave. And so in this video, I want to talk about the general precepts and ideas for lighting. So not only having a main light, but also some of the background stuff, so that you can get the right sort of feel for your own man cave. So in my man cave, I've got lots and lots of different lights. Not only this one, but also I've got a banker's lamp up there, I've got a main light, I've got... You'll see as we get on through the video. So before we get into it, click that like button, subscribe, ding that bell, all of that sort of good stuff really helps out my channel. And let's get cracking with a couple of tips that I would like to talk to you about. Tip number one, have a single main light. So the very first thing that I want to talk to you about is the main light in your man cave. Now it depends on how big your man cave is going to be, but you are going to need at least one decent sized light. Not necessarily in terms of size of, you know, the overall fixtures and fittings, but in terms of how much light it puts out. Now, in this man cave, I've got one central light, but as you can probably tell from behind me, I've also got others. And what I want to do with the main light is to kind of, it's almost like creating a recipe where you have one main ingredient, one main thing around which the whole dish kind of circulates. So you have one main light, and around that everything else kind of builds into it. So in this man cave, my main light is a single LED smart light that can change colour, and that is my central light. It's quite powerful on its own, and so for a small space like my man cave, it's perfectly okay. It will do the job. But what I do is also dim it at times, and I also change the colour. Now the reason that I use a smart light bulb is so that I can change the colour and dim it as well as raise it up so it's really bright like this. So if I want to do some filming, all I do is just turn it on and it's perfectly enough to film. But I also change its colour if I'm having events in here with some of my friends, like Dungeons and Dragons nights and stuff like that. Or if I'm just watching the TV, sometimes I'll turn it off, which is why it's a smart bulb, so that I can do all of these different things with it. Now this is a bit of a theme within my man cave, so that I can turn them on and off and dim them and all of that sort of cool stuff. Simply because I think that that will really help to control my space. So I'm advocating for it, but I'm not suggesting that you definitely go ahead and do it, because I know that having it all smart does cost a little bit more money. Tip number two, have a fill light. Now in this man cave, I use it for filming, but even if you don't, you will need some sort of fill light to make sure that there's not too many harsh shadows and all of that sort of stuff. What you're probably going to want is a fairly well lit area that you can dim down if you're going to have parties and music and all of that sort of stuff. When I was working as a DJ, the best thing that we could do to get everyone out of the venue at the end of the gig was to turn all the lights up. No one wants to hide in the shadows if there are no shadows. So you also want to be able to get rid of the shadows when you are doing other things, and certainly working in there, maybe not necessarily working like 9 to 5 job, but if you're working as in like building something or creating something or doing something other than entertaining, you're probably going to want a decent amount of light in here. And that's where the main light as well as the fill light really help to build out that sort of light. But the other thing you're going to want to do, even with these two main lights, is to dim them down. So I would highly recommend something that's dimmable, whether that's a physical dimmer switch or attaching it to a smart switch and having like internet out here. I would say that the internet being out in my man cave is probably one of the best things that I've done so far. Next up is some accent lighting. Now this can take the form of pretty much anything, but in my magical man cave I've got these flame effect flickery candle kind of bulbs. I've also got another one up here as well. Now these sort of bounce off the things on my walls and they cast the right sort of shadow. I know I said that I don't like shadows, but when you're working you don't want shadows. When you want the ambience, you definitely do want shadows because it adds character and all of that sort of stuff. So what I've done is to have these sort of very orangey kind of candly, flamey kind of bulbs. And also, if you've had a look at my fireplace as well, that's a very, very similar sort of temperature. They call it colour temperature. And that all relates to how orangey everything is shifted. If it's more sort of blue shift, then it'll look and feel colder. And so when I've got my light on, it's normally sort of daylight kind of bulb, and it'll turn everything ever so slightly bluish. So in my man cave, I've got the orange lights for when I want it nice and cozy or warm, and the blue light for when I want it slightly cooler and maybe more daylighty. So when we're talking about accent lighting, I've got fairy lights all around my man cave, not only in the lounge area, but also behind the bar. And I call that romantic lighting, which I can switch on and off independently. Now this sort of romantic lighting, because it is fairy lights, it kind of reminds me of festive times, Christmassy kind of thing. It's got that real sort of party vibe. And so fairy lights for me, I think, is one of the best things that I've added to the man cave to kind of give it that sort of almost magical feel. Now you don't necessarily need this, and all of these things, you don't need the specific thing that I'm talking about. But what I'm saying is use the principles. So use the main light, use the fill light, and use the accent light. Those are the ways of building up that sort of, that almost mosaic of light. Now, if you've got lots of different sources of light, it will feel more comfortable because it's a little bit more natural. And when you're talking about like daylight, it refracts off everything. Daylight sort of bounces off stuff and it almost acts like its own source of light. So it feels like the light's coming from everywhere. Even if you can see the sun and you know where that sun is, the likelihood is that if it's bouncing around and stuff, it will feel like there's light everywhere, not just coming from like a torch in the sky. So one thing that I've made sure to add in the Magical Man Cave as well is I've got candles. Now these candles don't necessarily give off a vast amount of light, but what they do is to kind of focus the eye on something. Now these are flickering candles that go up and hang from the ceiling in sconces, and it makes it look quite magical when they're on. What I do with the main light is to turn it blue and dim it down so that then all of the accent lighting almost takes up that mantle and says, you know, hey, I'm going to be lighting the place for you. It makes it feel a lot more cohesive and a lot more sort of almost personal. I really like the idea of having lots of different, very small amounts of light that then sort of build that picture. And maybe it's my artistic side, I don't really know, but I think that the lighting really accentuates what I've done here. So when it comes to this sort of wood, it looks like wood, it's not wood, and I think that it makes it look so much better with all these flickering candles and flame effects. And if you then turn this blue, so if I were to say, Alexa, set the stage.
Okay.
So it dims down the light up here, it turns it blue, and it kind of gives a much better effect, I think. Now, as you can probably tell, I'm kind of popping in this video because I've got that fill light still. So it does have a shadow now, but there is some light coming from here, some light coming from there, some coming from the fireplace down here, which is lighting me from underneath, although admittedly not very much. So you can see my double chin. But then there's also all of these extra lights as well, not only the fairy lights, but that sconce as well. If I were to close this door and block off that fill light, as you can tell, it's starting to get a little bit harder to tell that I'm here in front of you. Obviously you can still tell, but with the light behind me now being probably the predominant source, I'm now backlit and it makes it look not quite as good. Now this isn't a photography tutorial, this is a lighting tutorial, and it's talking about your man cave rather than filming in your man cave. And so each and every person will have a different feel for how to light their own man cave. What I would do though, I'm going to turn the camera around and so you can see the bar and see the difference behind the bar when we set the stage and when we don't. Okay, so this is what the bar looks like during the practical scene. This is what I call the practical scene, where I turn on the main light full and white. If, however, I were to say, Alexa, set the stage.
Okay.
Then it dims down the light, it turns it blue, and it also changes the lights behind the bar to a sort of greeny kind of colour. Now here behind the bar, some of the bar lights are red, but most of them are green. Now green is opposite red on the colour wheel, which is why I've decided to use those complementary colours to complement each other behind the bar when I'm using that sort of set the stage kind of vibe. Now blue and red look really good on this live on air sign, so it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't use other colours. It just means you've got to be really careful how much you use them, otherwise things can start looking like a dog's dinner pretty quickly. Now up here I've got another light which then lights up the archway, and what that does is to kind of add a bit of an extra accentuation or a slight different change in the colour temperature for that specific area. I've also got behind here a UV light which is really useful for lighting up a certain section. Now these are skeleton portraits that I've had created for me by Chris Curlicue's Allen. I'll leave a link down in the description if you want to get your hands on these, by the way. Similar to the archway up here, I've also got a green light in the fireplace that beams down on top of my cauldron so that it gives it sort of a green eerie glow. It's very subtle, but I think it really accentuates it, especially on top of the orangey kind of fireplace. So it's all about complementing these colours, but also sometimes clashing them together. If you look at a colour wheel, you'll be able to tell which colours complement each other by looking at opposites. So purple and yellow, for example, are opposites on the wheel. Similarly, orange and green are not opposites. The opposite of orange would be blue. So it makes it look good if it's done subtly and not too frequently. Thank you for watching. I hope you really enjoyed it and found something useful out of this video. And if you did, please do click that like button, subscribe and ding that bell. All of this stuff really helps out a small channel like this. I really appreciate you watching. I'll be back next time with some more magical awesomeness. But until next time, as always,
Magical.